Welcome back to the Femme FC Podcast. Today I'm joined by Kat Okholm Kryger, who is a researcher with UEFA. Kat, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
And Kat, would you mind just giving a little background about your history and experiences thus far?
Yeah, well, I can go back and say that I'm from Denmark originally. Moved to England to study sports rehab back in the days. My dream was to work in men's football because back then there was no such thing as a job or career in women's football. But I was told during my degree that women do not fit into the space of football. So I actually changed my career path and studied engineering for a few years before I sort of took a curveball back into the sports area and football area by doing a PhD on football boot research. And then once I finished my studies, I started working in academia, uh, working and researching and teaching in sports medicine and football medicine. And since worked both in academia but also with international, national organizations and clubs to support with research in football.
Great. And you're currently working within UEFA on research in specifically the women's game and trying to get that research and knowledge out to the masses. Can you talk a little bit about what that work looks like?
Yes, it's a really exciting place to be. I think we're sitting sort of right in the middle of everything here. So we have brilliant connections with the football world. So the practitioners working in the elite and the grassroots side of the game. So doctors, physios, coaches, and the players themselves. And then on the other side, we work very closely with the brilliant researchers from Europe or around the world. So we listen to the football world on what their issues, their questions, their challenges are. And then our job is to then formulate that into research questions and get the best people in to try and answer it. And then translate that back into the football world. So not just about publishing papers, but about actually producing helpful tools that the football world can use to actually overcome these questions or challenges that they've sort of expressed to us.
What is the current state of evidence in women's football? You had a piece a year or two ago about, can we evidence-based women's football? So where are we at with that?
Yeah, so basically what we did was we counted every single piece of research that's been done on women's football. And what we saw was that there's a growing trend of research interest, which is great. At the time when we did the first scoping review, which was in the year 2000, we had about 1,600 papers in total, which sounds like a lot. But then when you start breaking it down, I think we had more than 400 papers on injuries and over 300 on strength and conditioning. But then when you got to things like coaching, we had around 40 papers across all age groups, all playing levels, and I think around 30 on equipment, just to sort of highlight that there really are hot topics and topics that are really under researched. And even when you break it down even further, so if we take all the injury data and we break that down, then nearly half of it was epidemiological data, which is great. So like what we're good at is counting injuries. What we're not so good at is like figuring out how to prevent these injuries or how to manage these injuries in women's football. So that's where we're lacking a lot of research. And if we break it down by the body region, like 1/3 of the papers was whole body, which obviously was referring to the epidemiological studies. And then we had around 22 papers on head, which is obviously referring to concussions, and around 30% referring to the knee. So very often ACL injuries. So if we put those together, that's like the whole body, the head and the knee, that's more than 80% of all the research done. So if you are working with a team and you experience an injury which isn't in those regions, which is fairly common, like the level of research to evidence-based practice is quite low. So you might have to extrapolate knowledge from either the men's side of the game or other sports. But like that really highlights, that we have these, like we have a growing interest, but we still are very focused on very narrow areas within women's football. And like if there's a research out there listening, I'd really sort of encourage them to sort of look at the broader picture, because we need to evidence base women's football overall and not just within the hot topics.
Yes, exactly. Can you talk a little bit about why we can't just extrapolate from the men's game and why it is so important to create the evidence in women's football specifically?
So I think we can learn a lot from the men's side of the game and from other sports as well. It's not like we have to completely reinvent the wheel, but key aspects are, for example, when we need to understand the injury mechanisms. We can't just assume that what happens in the men's game is what's happened in the women's game. So we need good research to understand how these injuries happen, so that we know how to best prevent them. Is it contact? Is it non-contact? What is the mechanism at that time, so that we know what it is that is the trigger? Like, what are the risk factors? Like those are things that we cannot simply take from the men's side of the game into the women's side of the game. And from talking to brilliant practitioners as well, like for example, like hip and groin injuries, like what I keep hearing from practitioners is that they've worked with men's before and they follow the guidelines, but when they then work with women, it's just a little bit different. It's just as if like the injury is just a bit more persistent, a bit more difficult to get rid of. And that really highlights that in some areas we do need that specific research for football players who are women, and we can't just necessarily copy paste what's going on in the men's side of the game.
Yeah, exactly. And so, based on where the research currently is, I know you mentioned that a third of it is kind of whole body regions and mostly it's epidemiological studies, which is great, but doesn't really give us the how or why it happened or how to address it. What is the current state of evidence at? Like, what are still some of the things that what are the things that we do know? And hey, we're good here. Maybe let's move on to another topic. And what are some of the things that we're starting to get increasing knowledge? And like you just said, we don't just need specialty topics. We need like deeper dives into things that affect female footballers regularly. So can you give us a glimpse into where we currently are and where you would like to see us go with the evidence base?
Yes, no. So I think at the moment we're at a place where we talk a lot about certain areas. So there's a lot of research on heading and concussion in women's football. And I think we have good guidance now to how to minimize this, which relates to good practice, like having good quality heading technique. And that majority of concussions actually happen by, incidences that we can't prevent, like falling or collisions or being hit in the back of the head with the ball. Um, and then two other topics that are very well researched is like ACL, where I think we have brilliant prevention strategies, though they're not well implemented. So I think we have the epidemiology, we have the solutions, but we don't have the implementation. And then the last one that there's a high attention on at the moment is menstrual cycles. And I think we have a lot of research, and of course, I'm not saying that we are in a complete, we've fulfilled like all the questions that we might have, but I think we're at a stage now where we're quite comfortable in saying that the attention that is given to this topic is not balanced with the actual effects that we see within the game. So there's a lot of especially companies sort of suggesting that we should do continuous menstrual cycle tracking. And there have been a lot of claims, especially in the media and in the football world, around its relationship with performance and injury risk. And from our UEFA consensus statement, a thorough review, really can't see those connections. What we see is that menstrual cycle tracking is a brilliant health indicator, just like your blood pressure or a blood levels. So if there's nothing wrong with you, there's no reason why you should track this every single month necessarily. What we suggest is that you can do it in pre-season for 3 months, so you have a standard baseline. And if you think that there's something going on, you can go back and track again to see what levels you're at, but for a health perspective, because this is I say that this is like a power tool that women have that men don't have, that we have an early indicator of health concerns, which is irregularities to the menstrual cycle. But it doesn't mean that tracking it every single month would magically give you a performance edge or an injury prevention edge. I think that is a narrative that we need to change. And I think the research is there for that, although the narrative isn't there yet. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question perfectly, but I think these are the areas that we focused on the most. And then think I can be bold and say that everything in between needs some research attention.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And going back to what you were saying about the menstrual cycle and kind of using that framework of what we know and then what the research doesn't say, and then also what there still needs to be more research on. Because I think maybe some people don't quite grasp, certainly like when it goes to the media and, general layperson, it's, well, there's no evidence to support this. There's two different things here. There's either there is evidence that doesn't support it, or there's not enough evidence out there yet. And so when we talk about the menstrual cycle, as you said, like there's good evidence to support that, using it like another kind of vital sign or as a health status tracker. What the evidence doesn't support is changing training sessions or training a certain way based on cycle phase. So can you talk a little bit about what the research shows is not effective versus what there isn't enough research about yet?
Yes, absolutely. So first of all, I think it's important to say that we're talking about healthy women, because, I think what we often confuse is that, like if we have a player with endometriosis or PCOS or another situation where they have very severe symptoms related to the menstrual cycle, then adapting, their life around that might be one of the tools to manage the situation. But for the vast majority of women out there, like the menstrual cycle is a natural, healthy sign. I think we did a video on this topic recently, and Leah Williamson brilliantly says that humanity wouldn't exist without a menstrual cycle, and it's a powerful thing. So I think we need to think about it like that rather than it being as unfortunately one of my students previously expressed it as an illness, which it definitely is not. So going back to your question, we do not have the supporting evidence to say that like the phase-based training is effective in football. We do not have evidence to support that taking hormonal contraception is a preventative tool for to like prevent injuries or stabilize performance, and that you can have the best game of your life on your period, off your period. You can get injured on your period, off your period. Like it's a factor, but it's not a key factor in this storytelling. And I think the narrative needs to shift, because when you sometimes read and hear people's storytelling, it seems like women are a menstrual cycle, and because you are on this day in this phase, you will wake up, you will want to eat this, you will need to recover like that, you need to sleep like that. And I think that is extremely oversimplified, and we need to listen to our bodies always and learn about our bodies, so that we as humans and as like female athletes understand our bodies well. But we are not our menstrual cycles, we're much more than that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, where would you like? I know that there's a plethora of paths we could go down in terms of future directions of research in women's football. What would you think would be like the top priorities for the next 5 years or so of research in women's football?
See, that's a brilliant question, Nicole. And, I don't think I'm the right person to answer that question. Like, the way I've always done my research and the way I'm doing my research now is by asking the people in the field what their research priorities are, and they shift. So I think the key answer to this is to listen to the football world, and the key research priorities in the US might be different to what they are in Zimbabwe or in China. So, or in Europe, which it's my area of work today. So, it's it's really important that we don't simplify women's football to like a top three research priorities, because I think it really varies, and I think we need to vary our research, so we don't just do the most important, but we get a holistic perspective, and that researchers don't just jump on the hot topics, but actually use their expertise to bring that more holistic sort of view on evidence-based practice in women's football.
I think that's a great point, is that it's about answering questions that are relevant to the people, then applying it to the athletes themselves. And so not just saying, okay, well, here's the next steps of what exists in the research so far, but having more collaboration between practitioners and researchers. And is that something that your work with UEFA is trying to accomplish? And how can that happen in women's soccer? How can we collaborate better between researchers and practitioners?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like, my role here is exactly that. It is to sit down and listen. So we have expert panels that we listen to. So we have a women's health expert panel with brilliant people who've been in the game for many, many years, who will be my eyes and ears in the game, to tell us what are the research priorities or the educational priorities that we need to support. And if you are a researcher out there, like the way I used to do it, and as a tip for anyone, is to, sit down with the practitioners, go for a coffee and have a chat. And then, it doesn't have to have a set goal, we need to find something, but just listen and learn what is going on in the football world. And I think vast majority, if not all, the research project before coming here, it's like started from exactly that, like listening to the real world of, because as a researcher, I see myself more as a servant, in the sense that I'm there to help answer the real questions that people have, rather than invent those questions myself.
Yeah, it's almost like, people working in the field say, I wonder why this is happening. And then it's the researcher's job to kind of go find out why. Or, I wonder how I can help treat this better.
Mm.
Researchers help us figure this out.
Exactly. And of course, there's a call to the practitioners as well to then open the doors for the researchers, right? Because that's often what I hear from the research world, is that yes, that's nice, but we don't have access. So I think it's both ways, and I think the barriers come because they don't listen to each other and they don't speak the same language. So I think um, finding a middle ground, and sort of taking the time to listen to each other is a really powerful starting point.
Yeah, one area that you have written about is technology in women's football and the lack of evidence around that. Do you mind talking a little bit about the work you've done in that realm?
Yes, no, this is a very special place in my heart. I did my PhD on men's football boots, and I remember when I did my studies, I asked the company that was supporting the PhD if I could double the sample size and do a replica for women's cohort as well as the men's, and I was told that there would never be a market for women's football boots, so they were not interested. So I think that planted a little seed in the back of my head, and over the years, this topic sort of kept coming up. And to be honest with you, so we wrote this paper on 10 questions on technology in women's football because we, as individuals, had tried to talk to the manufacturers for many years as researchers, as practitioners, as players, and no one really seemed to listen. The irony was that when we then published this paper, at least for the 2 years afterwards, it was number one of most read papers of all published papers. So clearly, some people wanted to listen, but the manufacturers probably were more forced to after this, and it's been a nice change in narrative. The topics we talked about were quite broad, everything from the women's football kit, which I'm sure you've grown up with this as well, that, like I was, like we fitted into men's kids where like the shirts were double the size of what we needed, and the socks had the heel cap halfway up the shin because like they needed to be long enough, but obviously that didn't fit with the foot size. So like we squeezed these massive socks into our football boots. And it's only recently that manufacturers started designing women's kits, and even today the things that are taken into consideration, like the color of the shorts, and the player sort of like interested not just copy pasting the colorway of the men's, but actually considering, what is comfortable for me if I am struggling with urinary incontinence, or if I'm concerned about leakage whilst on my period. What can take that focus back onto the football and away from my insecurities with what I'm wearing. But the study itself was much bigger than that. We looked at football boots, as I said, which is a big passion of mine, whether footballs are appropriate, sports bras, things like hijabs, and whether or not they are welcomed into the sporting world, and when they were, etc.
And I remember playing in college, we would write down like our sizes at the start of each year for the equipment managers to order, our boots and the rest of our kit. And it was always, what men's size are you? And converting my women's shoe size into what a men's size would be and hoping that it would fit the right way. So aside from comfort, and we did have, I had Nicola Renwick on the podcast to talk about sports bra fitting and why that matters. But aside from comfort, what does having a properly fitting football boot mean for potentially injury risk or performance? And why is that so important to get right?
So again, I'm a researcher, so I'll say there's limited research in this field, but I'll draw the conclusions based on some research in women's, some in men's, and some hypotheses. But I'll try and be as clear as I can be when I'm doing that. I did a study during my PhD in men's. As I said, I wasn't allowed to do it on women, but we identified a football boots that we classified as comfortable and uncomfortable, based on the level of plantar pressure, so the loading under the foot. And we proved that there was a significant drop in performance in the last 20-30 minutes of the game if you're wearing an uncomfortable football boot. So discomfort is not just annoying, it's actually inhibiting you to be able to perform. You fatigue faster, basically, if you are running in an uncomfortable footwear because you're adapting the way you're moving, and hence fatiguing, which really highlights the importance of wearing something you feel comfortable in. And then when it comes to injuries, like I always say that the most common injury that no one talks about is blisters. So like we don't record it because it's not normally related to time loss, but we all know what it's like running around with a blister on our feet. And again, the same story, that it takes that focus away from the football. And if it's really painful, you might even, adapt the way you're running. And then again, it impacts your performance. And then we can go to like the more severe range. If you have a constant squeezing of an area, we often see that around the Achilles tendon or the forefoot. We see issues with the plantar fascia when you have poorly fitted football boots. So like it can be related to more serious injuries. So I think that's like clear enough that, like it does matter what you put on your feet, and it does matter that the fit is optimal. And the last thing I might want to add is the traction, so the outsole. So we have different types of outsoles, and they're named after the surface you're meant to play on. So you have the soft ground, the firm ground, the turf, etc. And they're tested and validated for men. So a man is generally heavier, has a bigger foot, has a more powerful acceleration, deceleration, change of direction. So I cannot say that a soft ground boot is optimal for soft ground for a woman. And I think the best advice we have today is that women need to try different outsoles, bring different boots, different outsoles for every single game, and find the one that's right for them. Like, the market is growing for women specific footwear, which is brilliant, and the research is coming to evidence base, the designs. But for now, I think any woman should look at finding something that's comfortable for them and having different outsoles so that they can find what is right for that day, for that surface.
Yeah, and so another area of research that you mentioned earlier has received a lot of attention, but obviously still highly prevalent in the media, is ACL injuries. And there's, like you said, there is research on ACL injuries. There is research about how to help reduce the risk of ACL injuries and effective prevention strategies that aren't implemented. So when it comes to ACL injuries, what are the questions that we haven't yet asked in the research, and what do we need to start looking into, or what questions do we need to start asking?
So I'm just about to publish a paper on this topic, which is to myth bust the ACL epidemic story. So we hear this all the time in the media. Every time a high profile female footballer tears her ACL, like we hear the story of an ACL epidemic or pandemic or another negative term, sort of indicating that we have a rise in ACL injuries in elite women's football. And going back across all the epidemiological studies we have of elite women's football, I see no increase whatsoever, which is interesting because the load is obviously much higher. They play a lot more, they train a lot more, which also is counterbalanced by a lot more of a professional environment, better conditioning, more professional staff. So it's interesting that back from year 2000, when we have the first paper, there's no increase in ACL injury incidents.
That
So
is
that's
really interesting because, like you said, that is the story that we're told in the media, is that it's this epidemic and it keeps going up, but that just is not borne out in the research.
yeah, yep, exactly. And then the second part of it is that, as I'm sure we both know, like the evidence is there on what to do to lower the risk of injury. We have really well-researched programs that show a reduction of 25 to 50% for elite, for grassroots, for seniors, for children. The problem is that they're not implemented, and that's across the spectrum from elite to grassroots, and that's probably because they're repetitive, they're not very exciting. People might not fully believe in the effectiveness because this is not communicated across, and the way it's communicated across might not be as appetizing. I think what we need to change the narrative around is that, it's not about injury prevention. It's about improving performance, agility, strength, making you more athletic because that's exactly what it does. Because when you're more athletic, you decrease your risk of injuries. So I think we need to change the narrative, and I think we need to incorporate these movements in a more exciting way, not just in a standardized, repetitive warm-up, but taking key elements of this into your warm-up, but also into the practice and making it a natural part of football, and changing the narrative that women who do strength exercises, who do explosive exercises, do not become bulky and manly, but that it's a really important and essential part of women's football. And we've just released a video on exactly this topic, where we see a lot of images of elite women players in the gym doing exactly what they need to do, and on the pitch doing these brilliant movements to motivate the grassroots coaches and the grassroots players out there to take part in these exercises as well.
What do you think are the biggest barriers to clubs and youth teams and teams at all levels implementing these prevention programs?
I think it's the culture that, I'm here for football, so what I want to do is kick a ball around, and like it's not part of what I want to do as a coach. And often it comes as well with the fact that they might not feel comfortable because they've taken the role because they know about football, they want to support their child playing football, but they might not feel comfortable with how to do a launch exercise appropriately, and how to give appropriate feedback, and how to integrate that into the game. So a lot more education on the grassroots level of how to integrate this in a fun way is really, really essential. When I was a student, I used to work in the tennis academy, and we used to do the fitness exercises. And I started out the first few weeks with squats and lunges and planks and all of that, and they hated it. And then we changed it into frog jumps and, spider crawling, and they were allowed to say like the animal whilst they were doing it, and suddenly they loved it. So it's about finding those little triggers that work in the environment that you are in, to make these exercises fun to do.
Yeah, and I think to your point earlier, you said, taking components of those programs, and rather just having like, okay, everyone in a line doing this kind of set script of things, can you implement it into what you're doing in a soccer training session already? I think that's something. I was a youth soccer coach for a long time, and that's something that I tried to do is, okay, we're already doing this technical warm up. What if we then add, okay, let's hop sideways over the ball and stick the landing? And I think that framing it that way to coaches would help with that implementation part.
Yes, absolutely. I couldn't agree more, Nicole. And I think a little add-on as well is, to give some responsibility to the players as well, especially at the lower level, because like you might only have one or two training sessions, which are quite short. So, like giving them the knowledge that if they do exercises, whether that's going to the gym and not turning to the yoga and Pilates studio, but actually into the weight section and start doing those kind of exercises, or involving themselves in other sort of strength and conditioning focused work outside of football, will also help their football and make them a healthier human beings. So I don't think all the focus, especially at grassroots, should be on the coaches. I think the players can take some ownership as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And parents at the youth level, right? Like, what are you like? What are the kids doing the other 4 or 5 days a week that they're not at football training?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So moving on a little bit too, we talked a little bit about like what you would like the future of research to look like in some ways, but I was wondering if you could go over some of the priorities around that women framework and what some of the priorities should look like according to that framework.
Yeah. So Rick Lovell and myself published a framework recently, and we sort of made 5 key topics to focus on, and the W was that we need worldwide representation, because we see again from the studies, the scoping reviews, and sort of categorizing all the publications, that we have majority of research from the US or Europe, but like luckily football is global, and we need that global representation in the data we're using, so that we truly evidence-based football on a global scale. Even within Europe, it's centered around a few countries. We need to be better at supporting research in the areas where that's not currently happening. Then O is for open science. So again, sharing data, supporting with because quite often data is limited. So you might do your study within one club, but you actually don't have the numbers or the data volume to actually come with conclusive answers. So we need to be better at sharing and supporting larger scale research. M is for methodological excellence. So I think, one key thing that I'm very firm on is that we don't just need more research, we need more research of better quality. Because I think one of the things that happened was that we had this shift in attention to women's sports, and we then let a lot of lower quality research be accepted into papers, which actually doesn't help with evidence-based practice, because it just confuses people on what best practice is. The E is for evidence-based practice, which sort of summarizes everything that I've just said. And then we added the N at the end in women, which is nurturing talent. And I think, that is a key area of interest, because the women's game from an elite level is growing so fast, but the financial side to support the academies and the development of women's football is not growing at the same pace. So we need to turn our attention to make sure that we have these wonderful players in the future as well, and that they are built to be strong, powerful, robust athletes who have a good understanding of football. And that will help both with the injury prevention, but also with the performance. So we put that in there as a key area of interest for the future.
What advice would you give to practitioners in the game to start practicing in a more evidence-based way?
I think the first thing I always say is allocate the time, because I know that practitioners are super busy, and I know that the schedule can be crazy at times. So if you don't allocate the time, it will not happen. And then, this could be 1 hour every week where the MDT sits down together, or just the medical or the performer sit down together, whatever works and is feasible. And then either it's inviting a researcher in to like answer questions on a topic. It could be, discussing a recent scientific paper. It could be looking into your own data and then discussing what that actually means and what decisions you're going to take from reviewing your own data. So there are many ways of doing it, but that's the starting point, I think, is that once we're in it, we often forget about the continued learning because we're so busy that we need to allocate that specific time to focus on including the evidence-based practice into the practice.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Kat, thank you so much for all of this. If I know UEFA is doing a lot of educational webinars, where else can people go to learn from you and see all of the education that UEFA is putting out?
So we're working on setting up a website because we have a lot of content. But at the moment, everything that we produce is accessible through our LinkedIn group. So if you just search for UEFA Medical and Anti-Doping, you can join the group and you'll get updates on all the content that we're releasing on there.
Great. And Kat, I can't let you go before answering my two rapid fire questions that I ask everyone, which is more fill in the blank. So the first one is, I wish everyone working in women's football knew this about evidence-based practice.
I wish that they would know that. Oh, that's a good question. I I think I will go back to the basics of what we talked about. Is that like we need to empower women with the data we have and not scare them off. Like not scare off like the new girls who are potentially coming into the game, or the people who are already there. And that's what we're doing at the moment with the way we are translating things like ACL epidemic stories, or that menstrual cycles are associated with injuries or performance dips, or that you are in that sense like fragile and unstable. So I think the way that we interpret the data is really, really essential in terms of like the credibility of the sport, and that we are all part of making sure that these stories are not the headlines when we talk about women's football, that the headlines are all the powerful things that we have and how amazing our athletes are and all the good things that we are learning that will improve the practice in football, both across the grassroots up to the elite side of the game.
Great. And then the second one is, my favorite thing about women's football is?
Well, I think I'm sure that most people have already said this, but I think the people working in the sport are just so incredibly driven. But with that comes as well that I find it a very inclusive community. As I said to begin with, I was told that I would never get a job in men's football because I was basically told that the players wouldn't be able to focus having a woman working with them. And I think we see today that the women's side of the game is open for anyone, no matter what you look like, as long as you are dedicated and motivated to grow the game.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree
Mm.
more. Well, Kat, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate your time.
No, thank you so much for the invitation and for the time.